Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and good evening to those who are dialing in from Japan and Asia. I thought we should start from Robert. Almost 2 months into this conflict, where are we now in terms of, the direction of travel? Yesterday, we heard some commanders in Mariupol sending a very dire message, telling everybody they are very much overwhelmed by the Russian forces on the ground. What is your interpretation of what's happening now?
Thank you, Vincent. Yes, 2 months into this full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, but of course it's 8 years since Russia illegally annexed Crimea and stirred up conflict in the Donbass. So this conflict has been quite a long time in the making. It's appalling. It drives a bulldozer through the international rule of law. And in the United Nations General Assembly, 141 member states voted to condemn the invasion. Only 4 states sided with Russia, including Belarus. And it's had very severe consequences, obviously for Ukraine, where something like a quarter of its pre-war population has been displaced. There are now over 5 million Ukrainian refugees who fled to other countries, mostly neighbors in Europe. Consequences for Europe more widely, for Europe's security, for Europe's economy, for energy prices, and consequences for the wider world, not least the great increase in commodity, energy, and food prices that have been brought about by Russia's war. I have to say, it looks like a huge miscalculation by Vladimir Putin. Putin seems to have thought that he could assemble this very large force, 180,000 troops or so, and just march in and within a matter of days overwhelm Kiev and produce a surrender of Ukraine. Well, he didn't reckon with the bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people. They have fought back. They're still fighting back in Mariupol today, as you mentioned, Vincent, but also more widely in the Donbass and elsewhere. And nor did Putin reckon with the united and resolute response from the Western world, from the United States, Canada, European Union, also Japan, Australia, Singapore. It goes much, much more widely. And I think we're now on to the 6th tranche of sanctions from the European Union. The screw has been tightened again and again and will continue to be tightened as long as Russia does not stop this war. I have to say, it doesn't look very good for Russia so far. They've already been forced to pull back from the north of Ukraine, where they'd attempted to get to Kiev and failed. They're now concentrating all their effort in the east to try and take the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts and to hang on to that land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea. But really, what Russia needs to do is stop the war, stop firing, and withdraw all its troops, allow Ukraine once again to have its territory back.
Thank you very much for the opening. 141 countries condemned the Russia action, 4 sided with Russia, and a few dozens also abstained, including China, including India. Now, Boris Johnson today is in India talking about a free trade deal, as well as raising this uncomfortable issue of India's stance on Russia. What do you think, Robert? If you are advising Boris Johnson, what do you think he should tread this line with Modi when he meets him?
Well, fortunately or not, I'm not in government, so I'm not in a position to advise Boris Johnson. If I were, I would want him to raise with Modi in very strong terms the need for India to join the international community, putting pressure on Russia to stop its war in Ukraine. But it looks to me as if Boris Johnson has decided that he'll keep that for the private conversations and, at least in public, concentrate on trade and economic issues with India. India, of course, is heavily dependent on Russia for its own armaments and supplies, and is clearly worried that if it offends Russia, it's going to lose out in that way.
Great, thanks very much. Satu, I want to come to you for your insights from the US perspective. President Joe Biden has framed this whole American challenge as democracy versus autocracy. Now, autocracy certainly, he was talking about China, Russia, and other democratic states. But India was brought in as part of the democracy, great kind of alliance in tackling this challenge. How much of a shock was it when India voted to abstain, certainly not coming out to condemn Russia's action?
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Vincent, for the question. Yes, the Biden administration has certainly used the autocracy-democracy divide as one framing element of the narrative on the war. And I really associate myself with Ambassador Brinkley's comments about the war, the state of the war, Russia's behavior, and the need to really stop the violence, particularly against civilians by Russia. On the India question specifically, as you'll know, the United States, just had a 2+2 dialogue with our Secretary of Defense and our Secretary of State with India. It's very clear that there is some daylight between us and New Delhi on this issue of their position. But it is not the only issue between the United States and India, as you well understand. We have issues relating to other international problems, our bilateral relationship on trade, including defense, I might add. It is quite true that India has a reliance on Russian weaponry, give or take 46%, pick your number precisely. But we also have a defense and military and security relationship with India. We continue to value that relationship. In the context of Japan, I would just remind folks that we have a US, Japan, India, Australia quadrilateral mechanism. Where the next scheduled meeting, as the rumor mill goes, is around the third week of May. And so we have a lot of interest with India. So despite this being a daylight issue and a matter of concern about India's position, we also understand that India is balancing a number of considerations. And the larger issue is how we develop our relationship with India in the global context, but particularly in the Indo-Pacific context. And India has made clear, as you know, both privately, publicly, but also in a number of ways, that their primary focus is the Indo-Pacific region and their concerns about China. And we certainly want to respectfully disagree with India on their position on Ukraine, but continue to work with them in many other ways.
Great. Apart from India, there's also China being a very important part of the conversation. Yujie, I wanted to come to you on a perspective on China. There's a lot of commentary saying, China holds all the cards, China should come out to bridge peace, etc. And then we haven't seen much action from Beijing. Certainly, Beijing is even doubling down on its friendship with Russia. What is your take on that? How much can China do? And is China actually going to exercise its persuasion?
Well, firstly, let me thank the Foundation to have invited me here, and thanks for Jason and Nana to have organized this. Now, Vincent, to answer your question, I don't think, having card is one thing and how you're going to play is another matter. So the issue for China in here is they're not necessarily play with all the cards that China has, and firstly. And secondly, China doesn't feel itself being very comfortably having all cards. So let me give you a couple of reasons for that. And firstly, the reason seems to be the Western conventional wisdom that is this decision that alignment with Russia is single-handedly decided by President Xi Jinping. But actually, in reality, this is just barely a continuation of China-Russia alignment ever since early 1990s and since Jiang Zemin came to power. So the previous, the Chinese president. It's only a matter when President Xi came to power and the entire China-Russia relationship being upgraded. So this is a continuation. And it's also based on a firm conviction that only through a bonded together with Russia that China will be able to counterbalance the global influence of the United States. And also China, that implies the assumption that America is in decline as well. So I think it's based on these two assumptions and therefore make the Chinese collective leadership make the decision on its close alignment with Russia. And whether that perception and that assumption is correct or not, and I think is perhaps very early to make the conclusion, but this does put China in a very difficult situation, which is that the Chinese foreign policy nowadays exhibit what I call it a permanent contradiction between, on the one hand, pursuing economic growth with the major trading partners such as the United States, European Union, and then simultaneously presenting a pro-Russia neutrality that would fit into China's own ideological conviction. So, but this should really be, I would actually argue, by closely associated with Russia, and that would truly harm China's own domestic economic development. So that is one strand of the economic difficulties. Now, secondly, the difficulties already exhibited on the US-China relations. But what China has been aiming at in the past few years, it is to getting closer with European Union, because Chinese leadership's view of the world consists in different polars, and European Union is certainly a very significant polar that China could work together with. But given the current EU-China relations is now in stalemate, I think partially it is also because that China has not responded the EU's request or EU's wishes that hoping China would be able to perform a more proactive role when it comes to mediation or ceasefire between the two sides. So this would also, again, make the China's international environment, and particularly the international environment with the West, even more difficult. But the caveat for this in here is that China realized perhaps it can never really sit in the calm term with the West anyway. So instead, what China has done is China has been very proactive to work together with countries that have already abstained in the several votes within the United Nations. So you will notice that significantly among G20 members, the numbers of abstaining countries are much larger than, say, for example, G7 countries. So I think China will work very quietly on the neighborhood diplomacy to work together with Southeast Asia countries, with South Asia countries, and also large part of Africa and Latin America. And perhaps China will find its own forte there, but not necessarily in terms of making dialogue and discussion with the West. And my personal opinion, I think China has missed the golden opportunity of mending its relationship with the West for not doing too much towards Ukraine.
Great, thanks very much. Hitoshi, I wanted to come to you to ask for your view on this. Watching all of this from Tokyo, of course, we know what Japan stands for in this war, and they have come out with very strong statements as well, and follow the sanctions, etc. But watching all of this from Tokyo, what is your take on our bigger question today, the war in Ukraine and the impact on the international order? What is your take?
Yeah, sure. I think you know that Tokyo is very firmly with the United States, Europe, Canada, and all the West. But yet, this may not be my government perspective, but this is my personal perspective. But yet, I am terribly disappointed with the current outcome, because everyone appears to be pursuing military solution alone. There is no existence of so-called diplomacy. But given the fact, it's easy to condemn Putin as war criminal, a butcher, or anything. And someone said that it's Russia who invaded Ukraine. Therefore, Russia needs to get out of Ukraine. That is a solution. But knowing Putin, knowing Russia, do we think that military solution by sending weapons to Ukraine leads to the Russian withdrawal from Ukraine? Probably not. Therefore, there is a very strong need for diplomatic solution as well. I say this because the consequences of all this is far-reaching. It's not just the question of Europe, but there is going to be a very severe confrontation between NATO and Russia, and depending upon what attitude China will take into the future, there is going to be a divisive world, economically, militarily, and such as cyber and everything. Are we happy with that? No. In order to get rid of that future perspective, I think we need to get diplomacy at work. I think NATO, in particular, United States, must be upfront in pursuing not just the ceasefire arrangement. Ceasefire arrangement cannot be done without much broader political perspective. And you need NATO and Russia needs a kind of arms control. And it's amazing to see Russia and NATO holding nuclear weapon and going to be a very confrontational world. Therefore, my recommendation to you all, why don't we pursue more a diplomatic solution? And for that, it is unfair to let Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. It will have to be NATO, the United States, the strongest power, needs to be upfront. Everything is carried on at the expense of Ukrainian people. This is unfair.
But is diplomacy possible at this stage? We've seen Vladimir Putin even doubling down on this invasion of Ukraine. I mean, Robert, I wanted to ask you, you being a veteran diplomat representing the UK, which is a significant player in this war, how would you deal with that? How would your Japanese counterpart say, we need diplomacy? How would you respond to it?
Well, with great respect to Hitoshi Tanaka, I take a different view. I think it is so important for the future of the world, for international law, that Putin's aggression must fail in Ukraine. Anything short of that, of Putin getting chunks of Ukraine and then that being ratified in some sort of diplomatic negotiation, would be completely wrong. And I think we've seen already that the Ukrainians are very bravely defending their country. Yes, with help from the outside world, with armaments help and with economic measures against Russia. They've already managed to get Russia to withdraw from the north of Ukraine, north of Kiev. We should certainly not assume now that Ukraine is unable to have further success in defending its territory. And I see no sign at the moment that Russia is willing for good faith negotiations. And they're not even willing to negotiate humanitarian corridors for civilians to come out from towns like Mariupol under siege. That those ideas keep on breaking down because the Russians can't stick to them. So I think we should carry on supporting Ukraine, and we should always listen to the Ukrainians, what they want for their future and their future security, which must not be negotiated over the heads of the Ukrainians.
Okay, you say we should listen to Ukrainians, what they want for their country, what they want in terms of Western support. But from early on, President Zelensky said, help us close the airspace, and there was no response. And he's now saying, cut all the Russian oil imports, and there was no response from Germany. And what would you say to that?
Well, what I would say is that the West has been looking very hard at its own interests. And when Zelensky says close the airspace, we've helped him with additional air defense. But we have not sent in our troops and we've not sent in our planes, because this is not, as Russia would have us believe, a war between Russia and NATO. It's Russia's attack on Ukraine. And with the embargo on fuels, in fact, the European Union has just agreed that it's going to stop importing all oil from Russia, as well as all coal. So yes, it hasn't gone as far as Ukraine would like, but there is already progress on that.
Mm-hmm. Sato, I wanted to come to you from, for a US perspective. All of this is based on the Western unity, right? But we are also seeing, certainly in Europe, there's potential great changes going to take place. We don't know the election results in France. Marine Le Pen has said something really interesting about NATO a few weeks ago. How far can the unity sustain? How long can it sustain? Is there a fear in Washington about a potential, divergent response as well. Bear in mind, later this year, there is going to be midterm election as well. We don't know the outcome yet.
Right. Of course, we don't know the outcome of the U.S. November elections. I myself do not foresee any major rift between European Union and NATO members and the United States on the situation in Ukraine or attitudes towards Russia. To my mind, there has been, quite extraordinary support for a shared position regarding Russia's just brutal invasion. There's also been widespread support, as you well know, regarding sanctions. I note that Germany has invited India to the G7 summit coming up. There are a number of major summits coming up in Asia. And while there is, a little bit of mix of precise Asian responses, I just want to mention not just Western unity versus sort of Asia or the East or the third world. And I would just cite that Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, a number of ASEAN states have very much backed the so-called only Western position. So I'm not a big fan of this Western versus Eastern characterization, even though I work as vice president for the East-West Center. I actually think there's a lot of support. And are there specific nuanced differences in approach? Sure, there are. India, we've already cited as an example. But I hesitate. First of all, I see very little so-called Western European, EU, NATO dissonance with the United States. I just don't see that forthcoming in a significant way. And I don't want to characterize it only coherence on that front because there's an awful lot of support from elsewhere. It's not perfect support. It's not total support in every category or on every vote or on every element. But I think the world is seeing the appalling destruction of Ukraine and the attacks on civilians. And I think this puts Russia, but also, if I may say, China really in the spotlight on this issue. And I think that has consequences down the road.
China in the spotlight. Yujie, I wanted to come to you for Beijing's perspective. In the last few weeks, we seem to hear from Chinese state propaganda doubling down on their anti-Americanism in their messaging. What is the game behind it? What is, they surely would understand, they cannot persuade European and Americans, in their state propaganda messaging. What is the target audience for, and what exactly is Beijing trying to achieve?
Vincent, I can't speak on behalf of the government anyway, so it's all my personal opinion down here. What exactly Beijing trying to achieve? I think Beijing is trying to achieve that sense of national unity, that for the sake of China's international.
Yujie, are you still there? All right, while we wait for Yujie to come back, I wanted to go to Hitoshi. How do you respond to Robert and Satu's response to your earlier suggestion?
Sure. I mean, unity is okay. But my question to you is, do you think that you have an exit scenario, meaning that by giving pressure on Russia and Putin, by sending military equipment to Ukraine, are you supporting the call on the part of the president of Ukraine, fight to the last person? And now the war is limited to the eastern part of Ukraine, and Russians are sort of concentrating their attack on the region. Do you really believe that Ukrainians, with the support, not direct combat, but support of NATO, expel Russians from Ukraine territory to Russia? Do you believe in that? What is your exit theory?
Yes, what is your exit strategy, Robert and Satu? Robert. How would you respond?
I do believe that that is possible for the Ukrainians. I think time and again in this conflict, the Ukrainians have surprised us. Countless Western experts have been looking at the comparison of forces, have said the Ukrainians can't possibly prevail against these superior Russian tanks and missiles and all the rest of it. What they failed to factor in was morale, the psychological factor, the fact that Ukrainians are defending themselves, their families, their homes, their country against unprovoked aggression. And they are going to continue fighting. And we should certainly not write them off and assume that they will not be able to prevail. And when Hitoshi Tanaka says that the war is confined to the east of Ukraine, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. Yes, Russia has simplified its military objectives. It's now just attacking on that axis, but it's also firing missiles to hit cities right across Ukraine, including in Western Ukraine. So there's no part of Ukraine that is unscathed by this aggression.
But I think Hitoshi also raised a really interesting point, which is what is off-ramp for Putin, right? Like it or not, Russia is going to exist even after this conflict. We don't know how long this is going to last, but Russia is going to exist. And we are not talking about changing a world order. So before the next world order comes along, what is the off-ramp for Putin, for Russia? What is your take on that?
Well, that's a huge question, and I certainly don't have an immediate answer, but I will say this. Hitoshi raises a very good point in the sense that it is important to consider off-ramps and ways of finding output. I do think the burden of an off-ramp is on Putin because he started this war, and it's his actions and his country's actions that have brought us to this point. So I don't think it's a responsibility of the United States to find an off-ramp for Putin. Now, second, I would just note, and Ambassador Brinkley and others will know much more about this, but there have been talks between the Ukrainian government and the Russian government, and in numerous sessions that have led to nowhere. And still the Russian onslaught persists. So I guess my question would be, while I certainly understand the need to find a way out of this, I don't see any evidence that Russia or Putin will respond to anything less than the kind of resistance that Ukraine has put forward. As Robert said, the asymmetrical response, the will to fight, fighting for their own homeland, indicating a number of Russian military weaknesses, NATO Western success in supplying Ukraine, to be frank. We've had up to now sort of extraordinary US intelligence about what Russia planned to do. So all these factors lead me to believe that really the burden is on Mr. Putin to find a way out of what seems to be anyway, an extraordinarily large miscalculation that's creating huge pressures on his economy, his polity, and certainly his military.
Hitoshi, I wanted to kick the ball back to your court.
Vincent, yes. Sorry, can I just interrupt to say
yes.
Dr. Yu is back if you'd like to bring him back.
Yes, please. Yujie, can you hear me? While we wait for her, Hitoshi, I wanted to kick the ball back to your court. Now, you say we need diplomacy, and you being a veteran diplomat from Japan, how would you deal with it? What is your exit strategy for Putin?
But before I respond to this question, I would just like to pose one crucial question to you, meaning that suppose that Putin were pushed, and suppose he decided to use nuclear weapon or chemical weapon. Do I think that the United States and NATO would respond to that action by militarily or what? Because the world order is very much dependent upon not just Russian action, which may not be Russian, but depends upon what responses NATO, Japan, and the United States would make in the event that Putin became so aggressive to decide to use nuclear weapon or chemical weapon. That's my question. Please respond to it later. But my exit sort of scenario would be there is a need for ceasefire, and ceasefire may be worked out by Ukrainians and Russians. But yet we all know that without much bigger political solution, we won't be safe. We would like, what we see into the future is a huge confrontation between NATO and Russia, and that may be in the case of Asia as well. We would like to avoid that confrontational world. We would like to maintain globalization. For that, you must kick off any kind of political negotiation between NATO and Putin. If Putin were to sort of refuse it, let's announce it publicly. Now Putin even doesn't wish to talk. So I'm not entirely sure if that type of approach for the dialogue started. It's only Turkish president or somebody else who had direct contact with Putin. Why not? Mr. Biden, President Biden, why not? Prime Minister Johnson.
Well, you say we need ceasefire to start with. China has been calling for ceasefires for a long time. Yujie is back now. I want you to go back to Yujie to ask her. Yujie, are you back? Could you give it a shout? Great, fantastic.
So sorry
Welcome
about
back.
this. I'm in an old building. Sorry, in an old building, internet is not really up to the modern age.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Now, China has been calling for ceasefire, but China said, we are conducting diplomacy in our own way. What does that mean? Earlier I was asking you about Chinese state propaganda, anti-Americanism. How do you understand? How do you sort of lump everything together and help us dissect what is really going on there? What is the end game there?
Sure. Let me go to your first question regarding mediation and ceasefire. I think we have to bear in mind China, or PRC, is a country that only returned to the center stage of international politics and after 1979. So the experience of a mediation for China is extremely limited. And to be able to play a mediating role for a conflict like this between Russia and Ukraine, that would require a lot of diplomatic finesse, which Beijing does not always equipped with. So I think it's the capacity that has constrained Beijing. And even if Beijing said that it like to see the ceasefire, like to see the mediation. Now, I think the second reason in here that is also
well, I think we seem to have lost Yujie again. But while we wait for her, what is your response, Robert and Satu, to Hitoshi's earlier question to you? Robert.
Yeah, thank you. In a sense, Putin's off-ramp is quite obvious. He has to withdraw his forces from Ukraine and stop firing and do that. But is he willing to do that? Well, I don't see any sign of it at the moment. He seems to be doubling down on the offense. And yes, of course, Russia has nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, although it supposedly has given up its chemical weapons under the Chemical Weapons Convention, but clearly it hasn't. And the risk that Russia might decide to use some of those weapons of mass destruction cannot be dismissed. It's not a trivial risk. But the Russians are also aware that they do not have a monopoly on nuclear weapons. And the Western countries, very wisely, are saying that if such weapons were used, there would be a response, but they're not saying what the response would be. They're holding back from saying exactly what the West would do. And that's called deterrence. It's leaving in the mind of Putin that he does not know what the response would be, but it could well be devastating.
Sato, what is your response to Hitoshi's earlier inquiry? Sato? Sato, can you hear me? Well, we seem to have a lot of internet problems. But anyway, so Hitoshi, what would you say? You know, we seem to be in this deadlock, right? You know, how to solve this issue? How to solve this question?
Robert, you talked about deterrence. But if American deterrence was workable in front of Putin, Putin would never enter into Ukraine. But President Biden stated that we have no plan to send troops to Ukraine. Then Putin thought, I had a free hand. But my question is, if Putin will decide, after being pushed, decided to use chemical weapon or nuclear weapon, I think there needs to be a firm stance that, not just saying we will have a response, but a little bit stronger deterrence.
But what is your...
One more thing, you talked about exit theory. And do we not have our leverage as well? Economic sanction and continued military support to Ukraine? If Russia were feeling that they were pushed by strong sort of resistance by Ukraine, they themselves may find it attractive to sit down and talk with NATO. When you talk about the neutrality of Ukraine, someone needs to guarantee security of Ukraine. Would it be Russia? It would have to be major nations in NATO as well. Do you think that Ukraine would talk to Russia without NATO participation regarding NATO's assurance of security? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm too, I may be too critical, but yet I simply cannot see all these sacrifices of Ukrainian people.
Sato, would Hitoshi's proposal be attractive to President Biden?
Look, this is veering into turf that's not my area of work and expertise, and I certainly wouldn't presume to speak on behalf of what would be acceptable to the Biden administration. I would say you referred to this earlier, at least as I read my country's politics and public opinion. There seems to be, at least so far as I can tell, very little bandwidth for a policy that seeks to do anything but help Ukraine. As you know, public opinion polling provided by Pew and others seems to suggest, and you can parse this public opinion poll in a number of ways, 3 or 4 things that are clear. One, an extraordinarily negative response to Russia. 2, strong support for a level of actions to support Ukraine and its resistance against Russia. 3, opposition to American troops directly fighting in Ukraine against Russia. So, I think there's probably not huge room to maneuver. I'm not in the government. I certainly would be surprised if there weren't efforts at understanding Russia's position in terms of what room there might be for off-ramps, even while other activities are going on. But I don't see much bandwidth politically or otherwise in the United States right now for this. But certainly this issue of nuclear weapons and chemical weapons continues to heighten this. And I mean, the reports here, I'm in Honolulu, but I know that a number of mainland papers carried reports of Russia president viewing an ICBM launch, apparently. So this kind of thing does heighten a sense of anxiety and concern about the direction that the war is taking.
I heard Yujie is back. Yujie, are you back? Back with us?
Yes.
Fantastic.
I'm sorry.
Welcome
Just
back.
come back to the second reason why China refused to mediate. I think it's also that China realized with this limited capacity offering mediation, and then perhaps the mediation will not be exactly according to China's preferences, or in case of China start to mediate, and then that perhaps it might come to according to China's preferences, and that is not exactly what a US administration would like to see anyway. So I think given these two core reasons, and that perhaps China and I wouldn't say refuse, but really sitting on the fence and play a rather reticent role in this case. Now, regarding public opinion, regarding the state media, the coverage on Ukraine, and I think let's put in the bigger context of this US-China great power competition, that anything what China is aiming at, it is aiming at to creating that sense of fear that United States being taking China as being the #1 enemy. And I think equally what China's image has been portrayed within Washington is the same. China is the #1 enemy of the United States. So I think this sense of fear and this sense of anger has been shared by both sides. And obviously, that's what the Chinese leadership coming to that conclusion, and therefore fit into that message towards the wider public. But however, I think within China, the public opinion are quite divided on this issue. And I think for first reason that most of the Chinese are very much against the war because of the past history of China and what has happened in the Second World War. So that sense of fear of war is shared by the Chinese. But secondly, I think let's also go back to 22 years ago and what happened with the Chinese embassy in the former Yugoslavia, and that was accidentally bombed by NATO. And I think that's the second reason why the Chinese wider public have that strong sense of fear against the NATO as well. I think those two reasons added together, and that has presented the perfect narrative for the Chinese government itself to tell a story. That story is because of United States-led NATO and has really moved towards easternwards and towards marching against the border of Ukraine, and that led into this war. So I think there's several reasons for that. It's not exactly really just black and white and saying all the Chinese against alignment with Russia and therefore against Ukraine. But I think within the Chinese public, it seems to be they very much dislike war, but they also very much fear that it is, again, United States has been put China as being the #1 enemy over there.
Mm-hmm.